are stories the world forgets. Tales buried beneath the noise of history, waiting quietly to be rediscovered. They don't shout. They don't demand attention. But for those who still believe in the voice of heaven, they are like quiet flames flickering in the dark. What you're about to hear is one of those stories. It comes not from a famous city or a celebrated shrine, but from the misty forests of Eastern Europe, where something sacred once touched the life of a man few have ever known. While most assume divine visitations are rare events reserved for saints or mystics, the truth is far more mysterious. Throughout history, the Virgin Mary has appeared to the forgotten, the poor, the broken-hearted, often far from the eyes of the powerful. And though these apparitions are many, the world sees only a handful, choosing to remember the most dramatic, while the quieter ones fade into obscurity. But sometimes it is precisely in the quiet that God speaks loudest. And so today, we journey back not just to a place, but to a moment where heaven brushed against the earth, a place called Turzovka, and to a man named Matusz Lashut, a simple Czechoslovak lumberjack whose encounter with the Virgin Mary would ripple far beyond his mountain path. Before we enter the mystery itself, we must first understand where and when this moment took place. The story unfolds in the rugged highlands of what is now Slovakia, near the small town of Turzovka. But in 1958, when the events took place, this region was part of Czechoslovakia, a country carved from the ruins of empires following the First World War. Born from the ashes of the Austro-Hungarian collapse, Czechoslovakia united two peoples, Czech and Slovak, into one fragile republic. That fragile unity would face decades of upheaval, war, and ideology. During the Second World War, Czechoslovakia fell under the boot of Nazi occupation, its people living under fear and brutality. When the war ended, another shadow took its place. This time, it was the grip of Soviet-backed communism. Religion, once the heartbeat of village life, was hunted to the margins. Churches were monitored. Priests were silenced. Public devotion was dangerous. And yet, in the silence, faith endured. In 1989, after years of quiet resistance, the communist regime fell. Just 3 years later, in a peaceful parting, Czechia and Slovakia became two sovereign nations. But long before that moment of freedom, a quiet miracle took place hidden behind the Iron Curtain. To understand this miracle, we must first meet the man who witnessed it. His name was Matusz Lashut. He was not a theologian or a mystic. He was not wealthy or well-known. He was a working man, born into poverty on April 10, 1916. When he was only 5 years old, he lost his mother, a wound that never truly healed. His family struggled so deeply that by the age of 7, Matusz was already expected to work. Childhood vanished early. He left home in search of work and soon became a shepherd, watching over flocks in lonely fields by day and sleeping under the stars or on hay in the barn by night. Life taught him to endure quietly, to carry grief without complaint. School was a luxury reserved for winter months. In summer, the animals came first. But Matusz was determined. He brought his schoolbooks into the fields and taught himself to read among the hills. At 13, a change came. He was taken in by a respectable family in the distant town of Frýdek Místek. Though far from home, it was the first time he experienced dignity. For once, he was treated not as a burden or laborer, but as a human being. They gave him a bed, a seat at the dinner table, and something even more precious, spiritual formation. They taught him to pray. He received his first communion, then his confirmation. For Matusz, these weren't mere rituals, they were anchors. In that household, far from his birthplace, the foundations of his soul were laid. For the first time in his young life, Matusz Lashut experienced something that felt almost foreign to him: dignity. But this family gave him more than comfort. They opened the door to something eternal. They took him to church on Sundays, taught him how to pray, and slowly led him to discover the richness of the Catholic faith. In time, Matusz received his first communion. Not long after, he was confirmed. He would remain in their service for several years, quietly growing in faith and strength, until the day he was called to fulfill his military duty. When his service ended, he returned home to Turzovka, married, and began to build a life of his own. But joy would once again be pierced by sorrow. His first daughter died before reaching the age of 2. Even in a time when infant mortality was sadly more common, the death of a child carved deep into the hearts of parents. For Matusz, it was a wound that would never completely heal. He continued to live simply, first working the land, then turning to the forests. He became a lumberjack, enduring the elements and the harsh demands of labor. After many years, he was promoted and became a forest ranger. It was honest work, and it kept him close to the silence of the woods he knew so well. And it is within this setting, precisely 100 years after the apparitions at Lourdes, that something extraordinary happened. It was Sunday, June 1st, 1958. Matusz was sent into the forest on assignment. Though it weighed on his conscience not to be at Mass, he had no choice. Orders were orders. He walked alone through the wooded trails near a place called Okrula. The quiet of the forest was broken only by the wind brushing the trees. As he reached a familiar spot known as Turzovka, he noticed a small icon fastened to a pine tree, an image of Our Lady of Perpetual Help. He paused. Then he knelt to pray. And that's when it happened. A sudden, blinding flash of light burst from his left. Startled, Matusz turned. What he saw next would change everything. About 12 meters away stood what appeared, at first glance, to be a statue. The form was unmistakable. The Virgin Mary, clothed in white, just like depictions of Our Lady of Lourdes. But Matusz knew these woods better than anyone. There had never been any statue here. This spot had always been bare, silent, untouched. Then, without warning, a gentle breeze stirred, revealing a soft lock of light brown hair beneath it. In that moment, Matusz realized the impossible. This was no statue. This was not a crafted image, frozen in stone or plaster. She was alive, and she was looking at him. His heart pounded in his chest. He understood instantly. He was standing before the Queen of Heaven. As their eyes met, the world around her began to transform. The towering trees faded away, melting into a glowing sea of white roses. The roses seemed to rise, forming a living hill beneath her feet, a pedestal of blossoms, lifting her above the earth. The vision was unlike anything Matusz had ever seen or imagined. The lady stood in perfect stillness. Her hands were joined in prayer. Upon her head rested a crown of 12 stars, glowing softly. Her veil, edged in gold, cascaded down to her feet. A sash of brilliant blue, also lined in gold, draped her snow-white robe. And on each of her feet, just above the earth, bloomed a single golden rose. Light poured from her face so radiant, so pure that for a moment, Matusz felt as if everything around him had vanished. Time, space, even thought itself faded into stillness. Then, as if gently drawing him back into reality, a wooden fence began to appear around the Virgin. It formed gradually, as if materializing from the light itself. Mary raised her hand and pointed toward a section of the fence. There, 3 planks were crooked and broken. Just beneath them, lying quietly in the grass, were a hammer and a few nails. Without hesitation, Matusz stepped forward and picked up the hammer. He didn't question what he was doing or why his hands simply moved, as if guided by something greater than himself. One by one, he drove the nails into the loose planks, repairing the broken section of the fence. It was a simple act, yet it felt sacred. When he looked back at the Virgin, he saw something he would never forget. She was smiling. a tender, radiant smile, one that seemed to carry both joy and approval. Then, slowly, she extended her hands toward him. In them was her rosary, gleaming as if made from celestial jewels. Matusz understood. She wanted him to pray it. But shame crept in, he didn't know how. He had never learned the mysteries, the rhythm of the beads, the prayers. But the Virgin didn't speak. She only turned her head gently, directing her gaze toward the very pine tree where Matusz had first knelt to pray before the vision began. He followed her eyes and saw something astonishing beneath the tree. There lay a large map, no borders, no names, just the outlines of continents and seas. Below it was a black rectangle, like a chalkboard, glowing faintly. It reminded him of a schoolmaster's board, the kind used to teach lessons to children. Matusz stepped closer and studied the map. At first, he didn't understand what he was seeing. Then, on the blackboard beneath the map, chalk-like writing began to appear before his eyes. It explained the image. Green represented goodness, symbolized by mountains and highlands. Yellow, on the other hand, was evil, and it marked the low, flat lands. As soon as he had read those words, the message vanished. In its place, new phrases appeared, glowing with quiet urgency. Repent. Pray for priests and religious. Pray the rosary. Matusz barely had time to absorb the message when the map itself began to change. The yellow areas symbolizing evil started to expand. Slowly, like ink spreading across parchment, they swallowed the green. It was as if he were witnessing the moral decay of the world in real time. Goodness was retreating. Darkness was advancing. Then the message on the blackboard shifted again. This time, the warning was starker. If humans do not improve, they will perish. As the words dissolved, new images took shape on the map. Explosions massive, terrifying, erupted along coastlines. Waves surged over the land, drowning the shorelines. He saw homes vanish, cities crumble. It looked as if life itself was being erased from the earth. The board spoke again, and this time the warning deepened. If humans do not evolve, there will be terrible disagreements individually and massively, and humans will perish in different ways. And still, the vision was not finished. The earth groaned, the map continued to shift, and Matusz sensed in his soul that something more, something deeper was still to come. As the final echoes of the last message faded, new words began to form on the blackboard, silent inscriptions glowing with gravity. But this time, Matusz felt a sudden weight settle on his soul. Something told him these words were not meant for others. What was revealed now belonged to him alone. Then the Virgin raised her hand again and pointed toward the map. The storm of judgment vanished, and Matusz sensed a shift in the air. He was about to witness something entirely different, what the world could become if humanity chose to walk the path of righteousness. Slowly, the bleak and flooded vision transformed. The darkened earth gave way to a breathtaking landscape. Everywhere he looked, there was life, lush greenery stretching across valleys, blossoms blooming in radiant colors, trees swaying gently in golden light. The land was bathed in a warmth that didn't burn, but embraced. It was sunlight, yes, but it felt like something more, like joy made visible. Matusz was overwhelmed. The harmony of it all stirred something deep within him. Every flower, every breeze, every ray of light seemed to carry meaning. Nothing was wasted. Everything sang. The earth was no longer scarred or broken. It was whole. It was what it was always meant to be. And then he saw her. The Virgin Mary hovered above the earth, her presence peaceful and commanding. In her hand, she held her rosary not as a weapon, but as a shield, a lifeline draped gently over the world. It shimmered across continents, binding them in silent protection. She stood above all nations, not ruling, but guarding, interceding. It was an image of beauty, of mercy, of maternal power. Below her, the blackboard glowed once more. A final sentence appeared. When you have accomplished everything, you will live this. The Virgin then raised her hand one last time and pointed upward toward the sky. In that moment, her image began to dissolve into light, and in her place appeared a radiant triangle, burning with golden brilliance. At the heart of the triangle stood a figure majestic and still. It was Jesus. He wore a long, luminous robe and a deep red cloak that hung from his right shoulder. In his left hand, he held a cross. His right hand pointed to his chest, where his heart blazed like the sun. Matusz stood breathless, captivated. And then it happened. From the heart of Christ, 3 rays of light burst forth. 2 passed on either side of Matusz like wind through trees. But the 3rd struck him directly, piercing his chest, flooding his entire being. He gasped, and then he fell. The force of the divine light hurled Matusz to the ground, as if the weight of heaven itself had descended upon him. He crashed face first into the earth, his consciousness swallowed in an instant. The forest fell into stillness. Time slipped away. When he finally awoke, nearly 3 hours had passed. The world around him was quiet, eerily normal. There was no trace of the brilliance he had witnessed. Jesus was gone. The Virgin had vanished. The radiant flowers, the glowing map, the wooden fence, everything had disappeared. The forest looked exactly as it always had. Ordinary, untouched, as though nothing had happened at all. Matusz slowly pushed himself up, his face sore from the impact of his fall. Strangely, his clothes were spotless, not even wrinkled. There was no mud, no sign of damage. It was as if he had been laid gently on the earth, though he remembered being thrown like a broken branch in the wind. As he scanned the forest floor, something caught his eye, a glint of white, lying just ahead. He stepped toward it and bent down. In his hands, he found a rosary. It was unlike any he had ever seen, beautiful, intricate, clearly not something that had been there before. It shimmered with a quiet radiance, as if still warm from the hands of the Virgin. Moved by something deeper than memory, Matusz began to pray. He ran his fingers over the beads with reverence and awe. Before the apparition, he hadn't known how. He had never learned the rhythm of the decades, the mysteries of light and sorrow and joy. But now, the prayers flowed from him like breath. Each word felt familiar, as though they had been etched into his soul during the vision. And so he prayed deeply, fully, without stopping for 3 straight hours. As he finished, a quiet realization rose within him. His mind drifted back to the moment when Mary had asked him to repair the fence. 3 broken boards. At the time, he had thought it a simple task. Now he understood it had been a symbol, a parable. The fence was his soul, and the 3 planks, his greatest flaws. He saw them clearly now. First, a lack of prayer, the absence of communion with God that had left him spiritually brittle. Second, a distance from the sacraments, his soul had grown starved of grace. And third, a hardness toward others. Matusz had grown blunt over the years, even harsh, using honesty as an excuse to wound. He was known to say what he thought without filter, no matter who it hurt. He wore this as a badge of pride. But now, in the silence that followed a vision from heaven, he saw it for what it truly was: pride, not truth. And he knew if he was to live the life the Virgin had shown him, he would have to change. Deeply, from the inside out. That night, as the sun sank behind the mountains, Matusz came down from the hill, a changed man. The world looked the same, but inside, everything had shifted. He had seen beauty, warning, mercy, and truth. And now, he understood what he had to do. Not tomorrow, not later, now. With quiet steps and a heart pounding in his chest, He began knocking on doors, house after house, face after face, people he had argued with, people he had wounded with sharp words, dismissed with cold glances. For years, he had worn his pride like armor, claiming honesty while letting anger speak in his place. But now, his voice was different. No longer harsh, no longer defensive. Just a man asking forgiveness not to be praised, but because heaven had shown him the weight of his words. It wasn't easy. Some stared at him in disbelief. Others shut their doors. A few laughed in his face. More than one whispered behind his back that he'd lost his mind. But Matusz didn't turn away. He kept going, humbling himself one apology at a time. This was the cost, he now understood, of walking the narrow path that leads to God. The next morning, he entered the church and knelt for confession. He spoke every fault aloud, not holding anything back. Then, receiving the Eucharist with tears in his eyes, he walked out of the church and into something miraculous. For years, Matusz had battled a deep, painful cough. Doctors had tried everything. Nothing worked. But now, without medicine or explanation, the illness vanished. Gone. As if it had never existed. He stood straighter, breathed deeper, laughed for the first time in a long time without choking. It was as if heaven had wiped his body clean, just as it had done with his heart. People noticed. Something was different. His neighbors couldn't stop asking questions. "What happened, Matusz? What changed you?" And so, he told them. And like dandelion seeds in the wind, his story began to spread. Whispers became conversations. Curiosity turned into conviction. And soon, people began walking to the very spot where he had seen the Virgin. Men, women, families rich and poor came to pray where heaven had touched the earth. On September 8, 1958, the feast of the Nativity of Mary, the first pilgrimage took place. For a humble beginning, it drew a surprising number of souls. After hours of prayer and reflection, Matusz stood before the crowd. He spoke not only of what he had seen, but of what was to come. With clarity and peace, he told them that difficult days were ahead, that his freedom would soon be taken. And then, without drama, he said it plainly. "In a few days, they will arrest me." That very evening, headlights appeared in front of his home. A black car, police. But before they could take him, the villagers surrounded his house. Neighbors stood shoulder to shoulder in silence, shielding the man who had become their witness to heaven. The authorities hadn't expected resistance, not like this. With no legal reason to storm the home, and no desire to trigger a scene, the officers backed away. Matusz remained, for the moment, untouched. But heaven's messenger had become a problem for the state. And they weren't finished with him yet. The following morning, the illusion of safety shattered. A formal order arrived. Matusz was to report to the police immediately, accused of inciting rebellion. His only crime, inspiring people to pray. The communist regime, deeply unsettled by the rising tide of faith in Turzovka, saw the pilgrimages not as spiritual gatherings, but as political threats. The church had been muzzled, silenced in public life. But here was a simple man reviving belief on a mountain. That could not be tolerated. They needed to crush the movement before it spread. And to do that, they would make an example of him. Matusz didn't run. He didn't hide. He packed no bag, made no protest. Instead, he prayed and walked willingly into the arms of the state. He knew suffering was waiting, but his courage was unshakable. He begged heaven for strength, not to be delivered from pain, but to endure it without breaking. The interrogation was cold and cruel. As he described his vision, the Virgin's smile, the light, the warnings, the flowers, the officers scoffed and sneered. They mocked his words. They laughed in his face. And when the report was filed, They stamped him not as dangerous, but delusional. On September 12, 1958, Matusz was declared mentally unstable and confined to a psychiatric institution. And so began the nightmare. Each day brought new torments: isolation, humiliation, psychological manipulation. They tried to unravel him from the inside out, feeding him doubt, disorienting his mind, numbing his spirit with threats, drugs, and silence. It wasn't healing they offered, it was slow dismantling. After 10 long months, he was released. But it was no act of mercy. It was strategy. They wanted him to believe he was free, only to rip that freedom away again. Months later, just as he began to rebuild a semblance of life, they came back, arrested him again. The message was clear: you are never safe. You will never be left alone. Fear would be the leash, and it worked on many, but not on him. The regime had mastered the art of psychological warfare. This was how they controlled dissidents: by turning peace into paranoia, by letting them live in dread of a knock on the door. For nearly 5 years, Matusz was caught in this cycle, released, then arrested again, dragged back into the system, broken, then rebuilt, only to be broken again. And still, he never gave in. The authorities couldn't understand it. They had destroyed stronger men with far less effort. Yet Matusz stood firm. He did not renounce his vision. He did not curse God. He did not retract a single word. To them, it was madness. But in truth, it was something much more dangerous to their power. It was faith. Real, unshakable, radiant faith. Chachby said. Even as the horrors escalated: sleepless nights, cruel treatments, attempts to shatter his mind, Matusz never wavered. His silence wasn't fear. His endurance wasn't numbness. It was conviction, rooted in something no prison or punishment could touch. During one of his final trials, the prosecutor, impatient and irritated, tried to corner him. "Tell the truth," he said coldly. "Deny the story. Admit it never happened." Matusz looked him in the eye and asked calmly, "Do you have a mother?" The prosecutor paused. "Yes, of course." "And could you deny her?" A long silence. "No," the man finally answered. "I couldn't." Matusz's voice remained gentle. "Then you understand why I can't deny mine either. Not the one who gave birth to me, nor the one who came to me from heaven." It was the kind of answer no ideology could understand and no cruelty could silence. What followed was his harshest imprisonment yet. They unleashed every weapon at their disposal: electroshock therapy, chemical injections, hypnosis, sleep deprivation, constant threats. They tried to hollow him out until nothing remained. But each time they pressed harder, he clung tighter to the memory of the light, the roses, the gaze of the Virgin. Eventually, his body gave out. When they returned him home, his neighbors could hardly recognize him. His vision was failing. He could barely walk. His teeth were gone. He was skin and bone, stumbling at the threshold of his own house. The guards who dumped him there laughed as they left. One of them sneered, "See you soon, madman. We'll be back." Matusz turned to them slowly, not with anger, but with peace in his eyes. "You can come back," he said softly, "but you will never break me, because the Virgin Mary is with me, and you can do nothing against her love." And in that moment, despite all their power, their uniforms, their threats, they felt something they didn't expect. Fear, not of the man's body, now frail and wrecked, but of the strength radiating from his soul. Without another word, they turned and left, shamed into silence by a man who could barely stand. They never came for him again. The authorities tried to control the story, calling him insane, dismissing him as a delusional peasant. But those who met him in person saw something else entirely. His words were calm. His presence was steady. He spoke with a kind of sweetness that could not be faked, and with a confidence that defied everything he had endured. And slowly, the lie unraveled. The people no longer whispered. They listened. They believed. The more the regime tried to erase him, the more his legend grew. And in time, even the silence of oppression could not keep the light from spreading. Matusz Lashut had become something no government could invent or control. He had become a witness. What struck people most about Matusz Lashut wasn't just his story, it was his smile. A gentle, radiant smile that seemed out of place on a face marked by suffering. How could someone who had endured so much torture, isolation, humiliation still carry that kind of peace? How could he smile like that? Yet he did, every day. As soon as he was finally free, he returned to the rhythm of grace. He never missed Mass, not once, and sometimes something strange would happen. In the middle of the liturgy, his body would suddenly freeze immovable, as if caught in a moment between heaven and earth. People would rush to help him, try to lift or shift him, but they couldn't. His body, frail as it was, became still as stone. Yet there was no fear in him. Only silence, only awe. The regime, still watching, knew their old tactics had failed. Matusz would not be silenced, and faith continued to spread. So they turned to new measures. They sent men to destroy the sacred. Images of the Virgin Mary placed near the site of the apparition were burned. Trees were chopped down to block the road, to make the journey to Turzovka more difficult, more dangerous. But it was useless. What heaven had planted could not be uprooted. I'll leave you with this thought. Every small act of goodness matters. Every moment you choose mercy over anger, prayer over pride, light over darkness, you are helping to build that world Our Lady showed to Matusz. So stay close to heaven, act with love, and walk forward with courage, always.